This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, medical, or mental health advice. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast and are not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, business, individual, anyone, or anything. I'm Sarah Edmondson.
And I'm Anthony, air quotes nippy, Ames.
And this is A Little Bit Culty, a podcast about what happens when things that seem like a great thing at first go bad.
Every week, we chat with survivors, experts, and whistleblowers for real cult stories told directly by the people who lived through them.
Because we want you to learn a few things we've had to learn the hard way.
Like, if you think you're too smart to get sucked into something culty, you're already prime recruitment material.
You might even already be in a cult.
Oops. You better keep listening to find out.
Welcome to Season 6 of A Little Bit Culty. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. Welcome back, A Little Bit Culty listeners. Please do listen to this upcoming episode with care because it gets into the very dark topic of child sexual abuse, but also know that it's got a whole lot of hope in it as well.
We're sitting down with Tom Krumins to learn more about his journey as a survivor of the horrors that have plagued the Boy Scouts of America and his role now as an advocate and activist for safer communities and kids.
Tom was one of the brave whistleblowers who came forward to put a name and face to the decades-long scandal within the Boy Scouts, a beloved American institution. And you can see his story in the recent Netflix doc, Scouts Honor, The Secret Files of the Boy Scouts of America.
He's here to tell us more about his experience in the Scouts, about navigating the aftermath, and his work today.
These days, Tom serves as the executive director for the U.S.-based Keep Kids Safe movement and as chief of staff of the global Brave movement, both of which are on a mission to end sexual violence against children and adolescents.
This isn't an easy conversation to have, but with the pandemic of abuse going on, it's very necessary. Here's our conversation with Tom Krumins.
Hey, Tom, welcome to A Little Bit Culty.
Good to be here. Excited to have a conversation.
Us as well.
Welcome.
Truthfully, we postponed watching the Scouts Honor documentary till last night. Didn't want to mix that in with our holiday season because it was a very well-made doc, but it was also very upsetting.
Yeah, to me, it was the most upsetting we watched. So far, we've watched a lot.
It's the type of thing that breaks your heart, and hopefully it fills it back up with hope at the end that it's only the start of the journey. So appreciate the fact that y'all took the time.
Of course.
There's some heroes in that too.
You're one of them, and working so hard as a civic entrepreneur and leader for 2 organizations on a mission to end child sexual abuse and serving on the Scouts Youth Protection Committee. Why did you get into this work? Can we start there?
Oh, short answer is it didn't feel like an option. There's moments where you feel dragged into something that's beyond whatever your plan would be. My original goal was to be a doctor or just a general entrepreneur. And as I was finding my way through the early stages of my career, the Boy Scouts decide that they're going to file for bankruptcy. And suddenly, this memory, this challenge, this assault I'd experienced during my time in the youth as a young Boy Scout, that all gets pulled into the surface. And I have no choice but to confront it head on. And that's how you spark a new advocate, is show a case of injustice, show an area where something is going awry, where an organization is trying to move beyond a systematic, constant issue within its culture, and realize, okay, someone's got to speak up. There's a few people doing it, but nowhere near enough. And so let's find our way. So I've spent the past few years since around February 18th of 2020, figuring out how I can jump in. Where are those opportunities to get involved, whether that's assisting with support for other people involved in the bankruptcy, or even stepping into the roles that I have now, helping with the Keep Kids Safe movement to do national advocacy in the US, or serving with the Brave movement, doing similar work at the global level. We're getting a chance. We're seeing the momentum build.
I don't know if you know the format of our podcast. Normally we start with a how'd you get in, how'd you get out type thing, but you've told it pretty well on the documentary. What's the best way for you to tell it? And would you feel comfortable taking us back there, maybe giving the abridged version?
What did you think you were signing up for? What was the goal of the Boy Scouts when you joined? How old were you?
So I've been involved in the Boy Scouts since I was a Cub Scout in elementary school, stepping in first grade and going through 5 years of different Cub Scouts, the Pinewood Derbies, where you're carving out little pieces of wood to go racing, or small scale campouts, working on civic activities and youth leadership. And then as you transition in 6th grade going into middle school, that's when this small world that I'd been in with the Cub Scouts became a whole lot bigger. And I entered into what's more commonly known as the Boy Scouts. It's something that I joined because my dad, he was an Eagle Scout. He absolutely loved everything about scouting. Both of his brothers had been a part of it. He was a volunteer throughout my entire journey and brought me in. It's one of the biggest things that had bonded us. And I could see scouting through his eyes. And for the most part, the image is really good. If you hear the pitch for what the Boy Scouts of America is,
sure, for sure,
it has that weight. There's a reason why it became the largest youth serving organization in the country. There's a reason why it was founded by Congress under the Title 36 and chartered officially by Congress. It was this idea of how do we build a new suite of a new generation of youth leaders that are focused on building a better version of this country. And it's been described by many as the cult of Americana. It's this idea of invest in civic leadership, invest in the next generation, find ways to get connected to nature with campouts or different activities or skill sets, learning everything from first aid and emergency response to how do you give back in your community. And that's a really powerful idea. And that's what I joined. And for the most part, that was the experience for most people that go through the Boy Scouts. And I'm sure this is a trend that y'all see with a lot of different groups that have that layer of cultiness. The vast majority is good, but there can be something that's really difficult and harmful simmering just below the surface.
Absolutely.
And for the Scouts, it was this culture of sexual abuse, violence, exploitation of children and adolescents, to the point where this is now, the organization's now in the largest child abuse bankruptcy in U.S. history. And we still don't talk about it. There's something there that needs to break through the surface, and we need to have that conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, I can even remember when I was a kid, the lure of it. And if the Ames brothers weren't so involved in sports, I'm positive we would have been Boy Scouts at some point, because we really bothered our mom to try and do it. It was just a little inconvenient with 4 boys. So all that said, when did your experience kind of take the turn and you share what you feel comfortable with about what's going on? And was it hidden from your parents? And what was that like?
This is where we get to parse out the different types of sexual violence that can happen. So in my case, I was a young scout. This is early middle school years, so 11 or 12, and happened to be at a beautiful camp up in upstate South Carolina. And it's just a normal day. It's a parents' night. It's Wednesday. So all of the parents have come in and they're all at this mess hall with all the counselors and the volunteer leaders and the different scouts. It's hundreds of people that are packed in having this great meal. I'm running a little bit late because I'm probably working on some volunteer project elsewhere. So parents' night, I'm going to wash up real quick and head on over. Usually that's something that shouldn't be allowed for a scout to basically roam free around camp. But my dad was a scoutmaster and one of the leaders in the space. And of course, let him run around. That's okay. He's a good kid. The challenge is that I wasn't the only one doing that. And a much older scout was there in the shower getting washed up. And he comes in and threatens me. And I try to run away. He pulls out a knife, which is not shocking. It's Boy Scouts. Everybody's got a pocket knife. And It's one of those moments where you realize, oh, I'm powerless. There is a big difference in what a young boy and a much older boy can be. If you remember those years of being in middle school and looking up at the high schoolers, I mean, they're full-grown adults pretty much at that point. And it was at that point that I was sexually assaulted and raped at knife point. And I remember what's really tricky about that is I had repressed that memory, but I didn't repress the memory right at that point of the assault. What happened was I experienced that my brain starts to dissociate, and you focus in on whatever you can to ignore what's happening to you. You're trying to distract yourself from the horror, from the trauma, remembering the feel of the plastic sheets in this really dingy scout bathroom, or the feeling of pretty cold water and the sound of it gurgling down the drain. Those things I can't get rid of. And what happens is right afterwards, after I experience this hell, after this assault happens, after I'm told I'm nothing and I'm never going to be nothing, I try to wash it off. You work through all the soap you can because you feel the shame and you feel tainted. And I could already tell that there was this veil that was starting to come over me. It was this weight. It was this sense of, if I do not tell someone right now, I'm never going to do it. And so I throw on my Class B uniform after I use every bit of soap in that shower, throw on, a little bit of scouting cargo shorts, basically, and a troop t-shirt. And I run on over to the mess hall 200 yards away. This all happened in the shadow of hundreds of people. And I run on over there, and I burst in the door, and the first person I see is my mom. And I am this sobbing mess. And she looks at me, and she sees the same thing that all of the other scouts are seeing: a young scout crying on parents' night. Happens every week. And it was in that moment where I'm looking at everyone, seeing the snickers, seeing all the laughter of, oh, look at him, he can't handle camp. That was the moment that I repressed it. It wasn't the assault. It was the feeling that because this happened to me, I'm no longer accepted. There's stigma, there's shame. I'm no longer a part of this. So at that moment, I couldn't tell my mom. I couldn't tell my dad. I couldn't tell anybody. In that moment, I repressed it. It wasn't until 2017 where I was doing a big road trip and happened to stop at the camp and see the actual shower, the bathhouse facilities, that it all came rushing back. You have that moment of saying, oh, this can't be true, but you know it is. There's no denying it. It's too painful to bear.
This question might feel a tad tangential, but I'm just curious, what gives the older boy the confidence that you're not going to say anything to your dad, who's a scout leader? Like, what's the ecosystem like where he felt confident to prey on you?
Had he groomed you?
Like, it seems to me like I wouldn't pick on the coach's kid, if I was a predator or whatever. I just don't know what the ecosystem might be like, where he felt comfortable doing that and comfortable that you wouldn't go tell the parents, 200 yards away.
That gets to the heart of the issue here.
Yeah.
We're talking about an ecosystem and a culture. And to Sarah's point as well, a culture that involves a significant amount of grooming. So within the Scouts, there's been this decades-long history with evidence pointing back to the earliest years of scouting, where sexual violence and abuse and exploitation was happening. It was oftentimes a case of grooming, where a troop leader, a volunteer, an adult that's found their way into the scouting program would build that relationship systematically with a young scout, and then either through trust or through communicating that they hold the power and you can't speak out, usually a combination of both, they then seize that opportunity, and that's when the abuse really starts to happen. One of the issues that started to pop up, and is actually a growing issue now, is youth-on-youth violence. And that's something that kicks out from that culture of grooming and of trying to hide all of this in the shadows. And that youth-on-youth violence is most likely people that themselves had experienced abuse. Not a guarantee, but most likely they lash out. They take their pain out on someone else. And maybe they do it strategically. Maybe they say, oh, here's the person and this person won't speak. I trust that the culture is strong enough. No one's going to speak out. I'll tell them that you're gay and that's not acceptable in this culture. So we know you're going to stay quiet. And sometimes it's just anguish and pain, and there's not rationality. It's just, I am this hurt. This happened to me, and I'm going to perpetuate the cycle. I need to inflict pain to feel something that isn't hurt myself. And so it's hard to tell. In this specific case, it wasn't a case of grooming. It was truly just the wrong place at the wrong time. I'd chatted with this older scout from another troop beforehand. And I think he recognized me, saw that I was smaller, and took advantage of the moment.
Well, it also seems that he took advantage of the ecosystem of shame and the culture that he knew that, like, I'm giving you the proverbial scarlet letter in this group. And if you go over that boundary and say something, you're wearing that. And that's harder than he's banking on the shame of that.
He probably did it before too, I'm guessing, and got away with it.
And that's the challenge. Either he did it before or he did it after. But it's one of those lines that once you cross it, the likelihood of it happening again is it's too high. And that just gives you all the fear for the current and future generations of scouts. Are they safe?
Absolutely.
Genuinely, are they safe? And I don't have a clear answer to that.
Well, the reason I ask that is because I think one of the ways for our audience to relate to that, I mean, think about the hierarchy that exists in high school. Freshman to senior. I grew up in jock culture. Like, that didn't go on in the schools that I went on to, but there was no way I was going to complain about an older person picking on me. And that's just picking on me, hazing me, like, boys will be boys stuff. I wasn't going to complain about that because I didn't want to be labeled whatever I was going to be labeled.
Snitches
weak,
get stitches.
That sort of thing. So, and I didn't. And I was compliant to that culture because that was the culture I had to go to school in every day. So I can only imagine that kind of onus times, whatever, to not go out and say anything.
That's a huge red flag for either culture, I guess, right?
Unfortunately, it exists.
Right.
Do you mind if I take that one step further?
Yes.
So it's not simply a culture, it's also a system of those hierarchies. So a big part of scouts, and this is, for the most part, it's a good ideal, but the challenge is in practice, it raises this issue. There's youth leadership structures. There's senior patrol leaders, and as much as the volunteers are lending support and guidance, a lot of what's happening is youth leadership. So imagine you've got the jock culture, the macho culture, and you're adding in that extra layer of here's who you report to. They've got authority. This is the older scout. This is the hierarchy. That is a system that locks you in. And if you're a young scout coming to a camp where you're out in the woods and you're surrounded by hundreds of people, but you also feel that you're out there alone, that's a dangerous mix. And how do we explore ways to improve that and recognize just how many red flags exist in that type of system? That
was something that popped out right away with watching the doc, is that there is no place to report without putting yourself at further risk. And with the shame layered on that, of course, you're not going to say anything. But the other red flag that really stuck out for me was that a lot of these people, the volunteers, and I don't know exactly all the different names, but can enter the system without having a background check or even a government ID. Like, that is, as a parent, now I know to ask that. Who's running this thing, and has their ID been checked? Do they have any priors?
There's no system of reporting that comes close to what's necessary. So let's paint a quick picture of how this is structured. So the Boy Scouts is almost a franchise model, and you have 256 local councils across the country, somewhere in that range. And then the National Boy Scouts, which they come up with the handbook, the guidelines. Here's our youth protection policies. They implement trainings and host conferences. But it's these 256 local councils spread across the country and even around the world that are coordinating most of this. And what's really difficult is that for decades, they wouldn't even communicate that information to each other. Mm. There are so many examples of a perpetrator that people knew of that would go from one local council and then move a state over, or sometimes even within the same state to a different council, and just pick right back up, do the same thing over and over again without risk or fear or worry. They had that confidence that the culture of scouts is not going to check. They'd rather protect the image of being this aspirational youth serving organization than actually do what's important to keep kids safe and protect those youth. And then you end up with this type of issue. I mean, 82,000 people joined this bankruptcy.
That is horrendous. And we've seen that with all the big religions. Catholic Church, the Mormon Church, the Jehovah's Witness. They all keep it internal because they're trying to protect their image. Who's going to join a church which is a safe haven for pedophiles? Who's going to send their kids to a youth organization, which is a safe haven for pedophiles. And yet they could have changed it had they not been so image focused.
There's a phrase that's used to this day called the scouting way. And every time I hear that phrase, my skin starts to bristle. The hairs go on edge, because it's a sign of, we are not going to focus on true protection of youth. We're going to move slow. We're going to focus on our culture and our way of doing things, because that's the best way to do it. And the only way to have that mindset right now is to ignore what's truly happened, is to try and push this whole bankruptcy process, this whole history and scandal behind us, and just take that next step and say, all right, we're all good. We've finished out here, and the scouting way is clean as a whistle. We're ready to go. You have to lie to yourself to believe that that's effective and keeps kids safe.
So you mentioned earlier that you saw the camp and that brought things back, but you didn't get involved and start to recognize and really reckon with what happened to you till you heard about the bankruptcy case. Is that right?
That's exactly right. The bankruptcy has been one of the most underreported stories. It's something that happened. It started on February 18th of 2020, right before COVID came in and took all the air out of the media. And basically what happened is the Boy Scouts saw a few states change their statutes of limitations for people to report sexual violence that happened as they were children. New York was the biggest and most notable example of that. And the Scouts got worried. We've seen a few more of these cases come out. There are now pieces of our perversion files, our registers of perpetrators and pedophiles that we ourselves have tracked. That is now partly out and available for the public. We're afraid that these new laws are going to mean a huge influx of lawsuits. So we're going to do what we can. Our Texas-based organization is going to technically register ourselves in Delaware, and we're going to file for bankruptcy so that we have future legal protection. We are no longer liable for what happened. It's an emerging playbook that we're seeing with more and more organizations, including a lot of Catholic churches. And they expected few thousand cases, maybe in the low tens of thousands. What they didn't expect was 82,000 people to come forward and say, going back decades with what we're seeing as a peak in around the 70s or 80s of people saying, this happened to me. Maybe it was something that involved, there wasn't touching involved, but it was sharing of pornographic materials or the initial grooming behaviors that we know are crossing a line and skew a young child's way of growing, all the way up to full penetration, assault, and even rape, and everything in between. And we watched 82,000 people sign up for this. And I want to be very clear about why that number is important. That's 82,000 people that signed up in the year 2020 in a 9-month window during the COVID pandemic. So how many people never heard about this? And how many people are not even alive today because they either passed or the trauma of this and the pressures of watching an organization cast you aside, maybe you took your own life. That's happened far more times than we can count. So whatever that 82,000 is, we know the number is bigger. The question is just how big and how much can our hearts take it? So that's how the bankruptcy is started. It's trying to have that liability protection from any future lawsuits from what happened in the past. They're trying to, officially wipe the slate clean and move on. And if it's helpful, I can talk a little bit about what that process has been like. It's been a journey seeing an organization weaponize the legal system.
Yeah, no, I would love to see that. I mean, our podcast is about abuses of power. And, it seems to me that an organization that's set up to teach, the principles and tenets of what America boasts, to have the leadership seek to minimize what's being exposed rather than be ambitious to expose it and fix it, tells me that they don't even represent the principles that they boast as well. And it's going to take the 82,000 men that they trained to expose them and show it how it's done. So I'm always interested in hearing what protects these perpetrators in the ecosystem and exposing who the people that protect the perpetrators are and how and why they do it. So please go for it.
Join me for about a 3-year ride here. So They file for bankruptcy in November of 2020. That's when the window to sign up is over. And they run through the different duplicates and make sure that there's a chance to see who actually filled out all the information. But the number that we've mostly settled on is around 82,000 people. And the first difficult challenge that's here is that we are not classified for the most part as victims or survivors or humans that have been hurt. We're classified as claimants. So everything that we've been through, all the trauma that we experienced and all the challenges that happen after the fact, that all gets reduced into this conversation around dollars and cents. I'm not able to sue them for past harm because of this bankruptcy. The only thing I can do now is to go and participate in this bankruptcy and hope that I get some financial damages, because that's the closest thing I can get to justice.
Which makes it looks like that's your objective too.
And you'll see everything from the scouts to these large insurance companies, the largest insurance companies in the country, because who wouldn't want to insure the scouts? They're America. They're as American as apple pie. Of course, you'd want to insure them. So these large institutions are now doing everything they can to frame us as simply trying to seek the money. And there's been Wall Street Journal articles talking about that. And then you see this bankruptcy go through the actual process where we watch the Department of Justice select a few survivors to step in as a tort claimants committee. So 9 survivors that said, I'm not getting any money out of this. I'm about to spend countless hours in negotiations and make this one of the big focuses of my life for the next few years. These brave men stepped up and said, we're going to participate in this. And they then engaged in negotiations constantly. We watched as they and the teams that represented them were negotiating with insurance companies, with the Boy Scouts directly, and with some of these large lawyers that work in the mass tort world. You can think of asbestos cases as another good example. These lawyers come in, borrowing money from Wall Street, getting as many survivors as they possibly can to sign up, and then saying, all right, we have enough people. What's the biggest payout that we can get with the least amount of work? And then let's settle and move on. And I'll tell you, that was a big success. Their lawyers are going to walk away from this with probably close to $1 billion. And that's, that itself hurts. So you see this bankruptcy process as a battle mostly between insurance companies, the Boy Scouts, these groups called chartered organizations that host a troop. Picture a church or a local YMCA that would host a local troop in their facility. And then these mass tort lawyers all negotiating over dollars and cents and assets. It's language around debtors and creditors. And what gets pushed to the side most of the time is 82,000 broken men. And that's just seems to be par for the course. Ugh. We go through this whole process and we are now at a stage where we have the largest settlement trust that's ever been pulled together for a child abuse bankruptcy. The numbers differ because insurance claims are to this day still being sorted out, but there's a likelihood that it'll go above $3 billion in the settlement trust. That sounds like a big number. That is a big number. But if you do basic math and you divide that by 82,000 people, that is very little. And it does not even come close to covering someone's therapy expenses, let alone all the other harms that are out there that people have had to deal with. So this bankruptcy just said, there is no path to justice. What is the least amount of money that we can pass off to you to make this go away? And the scouts get to step forward into the next chapter of life, free and clear. And who's left holding the bag? Survivors.
Can you do the math for me? I'm trying to do the basic math.
So let's say we've got 3 billion exactly. Divide that by 82,000. That's going to come out to $36,585 before lawyers take 30 to 40%.
This podcast wouldn't happen without our amazing, supportive, generous patrons. Are you with us? Come find us over on Patreon at patreon.com/alittlebitculty for bonus episodes, exclusive content, and the occasional Zoom with our fan favorites from our past episodes. It's a lot of fun over there, people.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
The Frankies were a picture-perfect influencer family, but everything wasn't as it seemed.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here asking for help. He's emaciated. He's got tape around his legs. Ruby Frankie is his mom's name.
Infamous is covering Ruby Frankie, the world of Mormonism, and a secret therapy group that ruined lives. Listen to Infamous wherever you get your podcasts.
Break time's over, people. Let's get back to this episode of A Little Bit Culty. It's a good one. Yeah. With a tort like that, how do you even put a price on pornography versus full rape? Like, how is that even determined?
I get to say there's 6 tiers, and I'm fortunate enough to be in the most painful and difficult tier. I think what's really difficult here is that through this process, they spoke with experts and they outlined what would that look like if we had all the money in the world? What would a reasonable, whatever that means, payout look like for someone that's experienced those 6 levels of abuse, starting with non-touching all the way up to assault or rape? Those numbers are in line with things that you would see with, say, the USC gymnastics team and their bankruptcy. And you go million plus, that's that it's hard to put a number on it, but that seems like that can help somebody start to heal and cover what they've had to do to take care of themselves along this journey. But then you see what the actual amount is. And it drops from them explicitly saying, this is what we believe it's technically worth, all the way down to an average of that 30,000 or so. And what's especially difficult is that that's only if you go through the full process. This bankruptcy is still not over. We're having to fill out questionnaires that will get reviewed by a federal judge involved in this bankruptcy settlement trust. They're going to dig into our histories, knowing fully well that most of us don't have a lot of clear information. When you're a child and you experience this, you're not going to have a clear memory. The science shows that's not how people remember things. And so you have to go through this potentially multi-year process to get pennies on the dollar that then have 30 to 40% scraped off by lawyers. They also gave this one-time $3,500 option that says, all right, you can take this check now. You cannot sue the scouts for any past abuse, but your journey with this bankruptcy is over. And I don't know the official number, but at least 9,000 people have taken that option. And it's not because they said this is good. It's because they said, I need to be done with this. This is too painful. I need to get out of this. And that stinks. $3,500 for all of that.
That's embarrassing.
Money's not the solution to trauma. It may help, but unfortunately, that's the only thing that a government can offer, unless it's going to offer some therapy.
This whole time you're talking, I have this burning question, which is, like, if they're going to have to pay out anyway, is the point of the bankruptcy, for those who haven't seen the doc, to protect them from an investigation? Or what's, like, if they're paying anyway, why go bankrupt? So they pay less?
It's to get it over with.
It's a little bit of both. So there's 2 types of bankruptcy that exists. And what we're seeing is a really scary trend of different organizations picking just one of those options. So imagine you're an organization, maybe you're a church or a faith institution, maybe you're the Boy Scouts, maybe you're a sporting program that serves youth, any group that says, we know we have a history of this and we are at risk of being sued for it, which, good. If this has happened, you should be at risk for being sued. And they say, we now have 2 options. We either go for Chapter 7 bankruptcy and we liquidate all our assets and we no longer exist. We failed in our most basic goal of protecting the youth that we serve, and we don't get to exist anymore. We are completely done, Chapter 7. Or you see the trend that we're starting to watch happen now, which is Chapter 11, where They go through this process. They spend out as much as they possibly can to all of the creditors. So not just the survivors, but the insurance companies that are involved or the chartered organizations. Everybody's getting involved in this piece. And once you finish out that bankruptcy, once all the different groups agree on a plan and say, I guess this is the best we can do, then they are now federally protected from any future lawsuits based on whatever is covered in that bankruptcy. Basically, the Scouts can't be sued for past harms that fall under this. And that's what they're looking for. It's that liability shield.
How is that okay? How is that even a thing that is possible? Where does this come from? Where does Chapter 11 come from? Who started that?
Congress started it for businesses.
I'm Canadian. I get to ask.
It's
right.
It's a business bankruptcy. That's what it's dollars and cents. It's my business did not manage to line up where our flow of money isn't quite working out. Maybe we took the wrong swing. We invested in the wrong thing. And sure enough, we don't have the money to pay everybody out. So we file for bankruptcy. And now it's being used by organizations to cover up for child abuse. That is not how Congress intended this.
Shame on them. Shame on the Boy Scouts.
Well, I mean, the thing is, if you're using a business loophole to do it, what was the business? And they claim it was, to grow kids.
Well, this leads us to a perfect question. Here on A Little Bit Culty, we always want to understand how public policy and the letter of the law needs to change in order to fight these types of abuses. What else should we be asking our lawmakers as concerned citizens and constituents?
Can I dive into the statute of limitations just a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So that's the low-hanging fruit, in my opinion. And this case right now shows why statutes of limitations are so important. So federal bankruptcy, every single state in the country, every U.S. territory as well, is involved in this in some way, shape, or form. And every single state has a different statute of limitations. Well, for the listeners who may not know what that term is, that basically says, here is the number of years that you have to sue somebody for something that happened. It makes sense if you're Farmer Joe and Farmer Eddie took your cow and a few years pass and, well, there's no cow there. So how do you have the evidence? How do you prove that? Statute of limitations makes sense. It means that you can't just arbitrarily sue anybody at any point for anything. That makes sense. But it really doesn't work here. Because think about it. I live in South Carolina. Our statute of limitations says you need to come forward with a claim of sexual violence you experienced as a child, either by the age of 27 or, if you repressed it, within 3 years of that memory coming to the surface. The average age for someone to come forward and share with anybody, not in a lawsuit, but even with a partner, a loved one, a family member, the average age is 52 years old.
Oh my God.
And if I'm doing the math, 27 times 2 is 54. I mean, that's pretty much half your life has already passed by knowing that you couldn't ever file, that you couldn't even have a chance to seek justice, not even have a guarantee, but just try to file a claim and go through that process. And to show just how arbitrary it is, I joined this bankruptcy in November of 2020. I was 26 years old. And it took me a little while to figure out who my lawyer was going to be. I did as much research as I could. And when I finally settled on someone in January, the first question they asked me was, well, have you filed a claim in South Carolina? I said, no. They said, how old are you? I said, I just turned 27 in December. They said, well, you can't do it anymore. I joined a federal bankruptcy technically in the statute in my own state, but because I didn't file that separate claim, now whatever I get is pennies on the dollar. And if that's confusing, that's the point. That's the issue.
Right.
There are so many states right now. There's a great group that is called Child USA that I fortunately sit on the board of with Mike Render that you've had on the podcast before.
Yeah.
And they're working to change all of these statutes across the country and say, number one, let's open this up. If you've experienced sexual violence as a child, especially, you take as long as you need. Let's follow the science. It takes time for you to heal and feel comfortable coming forward. Let's just not apply statutes of limitations here. And because we've been so far behind for as long as we have, let's make it possible for people to come forward in what's called a revival window. You get a year, maybe 3 years to come forward and say this happened, and then we can move into a better model. So we're in the process of doing that all across the country. There's bills that are getting advanced in Ohio that just passed, or bills in Alabama and South Carolina that are trying to make a difference, but we don't know how that's going to play out. And that's a really important one. I think the second piece is around Chapter 11 bankruptcy itself. No organization, I don't care who you are or how storied your past is or how aspirational your goals are, no organization should ever be able to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for systematic institutionalized child abuse. That should be just removed as an option. If you get to this level, then you forfeited your role. You didn't protect the youth you serve, and you don't get that opportunity. And maybe there's other ways to pursue scouting. Those are I think the two big pieces that we can really address right now. And then the third one is more how organizations work with each other. We know that different predators or perpetrators will bounce within scouts, or will even bounce between different organizations. They can show up in, say, a Big Brothers Big Sisters, or in a church or faith setting, or in the Boy Scouts, and they can bounce between all of those. And how do we build a system to track and to flag those people that have been removed from one organization for this problematic behavior in a way it respects everybody and says, hey, we're not going to do false accusations here, but it makes sure that if that's a tangible issue, if it's clear that there's that pattern of behavior, then that should be flagged for every youth serving organization. So there's all these different models that we can work towards, but the big two I'm focused on right now are statute of limitations and Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
The very fact that the response of the organization to file Chapter 11 is the most telling thing ever, as opposed to concern for 82,000 people that may have had a big experience. One of the people that Sarah and I really had a problem with was what was the leader's name?
In the documentary, I forget his name.
The former general counsel. Mm-hmm.
And he tried to flex, he was this noble guy. He's like, one is enough. But he had 82,000 people and tried to minimize the abuse. And I just thought, oh God.
Did you hear his deflection? Nippy and I were debating whether it was gaslighting or not.
There were a few. I remember the over how many years. That's one that's
over how many years. And also he was like, basically he was saying, like Nippy said, like trying to be all honorable, like one is too many for us and that one is enough. Then he basically said, in any organization, there's going to be predators. In any community, there's going to be predators. So there's obviously going to be predators here.
He tried to make it like analogous to society. And I'm just like, no, this is an organization that's specifically
for the youth,
promoting character and all these things in boys. You can't have this anywhere close. And he is right. One is too many, let alone 82,000. And the fact that he feels like, it's collateral damage to running a business is really what I was hearing was sickening. And the fact that he seeks to protect it rather than not get the rot out is just very telling for me. And an admission of guilt.
Yeah. Chapter 11 is an admission of guilt.
Yeah, for me.
Oh, and for the government as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very clear admission and recognition, but it's also a dodge and a liability shield. And I'm so glad that you brought up that specific argument that was raised, because it's technically true, but it's disingenuous. So
right.
This happens everywhere. Let's go ahead and say it. Sexual violence against children and adolescents happens everywhere. It happens in faith institutions, youth sporting programs. It happens in the home, especially. We're seeing a lot of rise there, especially with online harms. That's a whole nother bucket to deal with. You can see it in camping associations or in schools or foster care settings. It happens everywhere. The challenge is that this is a really bad baseline we're currently at. And the Boy Scouts managed to build something that is far worse. And you have this culture of going out into the woods, which beautiful. I love camping. But when you do it in a structured organization that isn't managing it as well as they can, that's an area of deep, deep concern. It has that masculine culture. That's saying if something happens to you, if you are the victim of something, you don't talk about it, you toughen up, because otherwise we'll ridicule and outcast you. That's a culture that still to this day exists. And I think it's moving in the right direction, but it needs to move faster. And then you also have that franchise model where there's all of these 250 plus local councils that operate slightly on their own, but slightly connected. They all have their own ways of operating. And do they communicate well with each other? Not as well as they should. There's gaps everywhere. And one extra layer here is that every troop within every local council has to be chartered by another organization, usually a church or faith institution. So these areas that we know are also problematic, you now have a permeable membrane. You have this place where people can jump back and forth. And priests also serve as scout troop leaders. And that abuse can happen in both settings. It carries back and forth. So if you look at the model and say, all right, we're focused on youth protection. What does this model look like? I'd say it looks like a piece of Swiss cheese. There's just holes and gaps everywhere, and you can do as much as possible, but we're not even getting to the bare minimum yet. We're moving there, but nowhere near where we need to.
And now, a brief message from our Little Bit Culty sponsors.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
Break time's over, people. Let's get back to this episode of A Little Bit Culty. It's a good one. Tom, if I was interested in abusing children, that's where I would go. That seems like a safe organization for me if I'm that kind of person. Or, I could find a place pretty quickly by getting into that ecosystem. Moreover, Michael Johnson, if you guys watch the documentary, Michael Johnson is the guy that kind of comes in and is like, what's going on here?
He's the main whistleblower.
And he's just like not having any of it. When the culture does get someone who embodies those principles, they don't even know how to handle it and process them. They don't even know how to go, this guy needs to be in the position of authority and leadership because he embodies everything that we have. And I've said this, and I was watching this and I was like, I had this conversation about a month ago with a friend of mine. He's like, imagine if America were to design the perfect political presidential candidate. There's no way that person would get elected. They just wouldn't let it happen. The system is such where it doesn't know how to process good people anymore and put them in the positions of leadership. And if you watch the documentary, Michael Johnson gave me goosebumps because he just stands for...
Are you friends with him?
We've had the chance to connect a few times, and I argue it's a heightened level of fire even in person. And when you hear all the different stories, you realize there are those gaps.
Yeah, and he gave me the goosebumps. I was like, seeing someone like that go in and do the job that he was doing and not backing down, it made me feel good about a lot of things.
There was hope. There was some hope at the end of the doc.
Which is a good segue to our...
So, Tom, you've really stepped into a service mindset. What does it take at a grassroots level to tackle something as big as this? What's the strategy? We've talked a little bit about this. But where do you start with something this insidious? How do you climb that big of a mountain?
I am beyond delighted that you just used that analogy. That's the same one that I use constantly. Most people, when they hear of this issue and really start to pull back the veil on the scale of what's happening, we're talking conservatively 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 13 boys per the CDC, although other estimates are saying it's as high as 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 6 boys that experience some form of sexual violence, abuse, or exploitation before the age of 18. I mean, that's staggering. That means it's in every single community. That means that regardless of your socioeconomic status, your gender, your race, your religion, your geography, the presence of ability or disability, anybody is at risk of dealing with this. And the first reaction is, I don't want to look at this and I'm going to just avoid it. Stigma, shame, the veil goes up. The second reaction is overwhelmed. This is too big. That mountain is too big to climb. And the reaction I try to focus people on is the third one, which is not looking at the mountain, but looking at all the people around you trying to climb it. Because right now we have people all over the country and around the world that are working on this. They've been doing it for generations, for all of time. There are people that say, we need to keep kids safe. We need to be brave. We need to do what we can to protect our kids. And you see them show up in school board meetings or at youth sporting programs. Sarah, you'd actually said that you know to check and ask, has this person been vetted? Has this volunteer been vetted? It's individual people stepping up and taking those small steps to raise awareness. They're already doing that. That's already happening. The challenge is it's just not at scale. So when we look around and we see people trying to make a difference in every facet of society to protect our kids in the next generation, the question is, how do we start to coordinate? And this is where I think it gets fun. This is where it gets very hopeful, because when you talk to people that are advocating, there's this sense of, I don't know what's happening, but it's more special than it's ever been. There's something that's beginning to simmer just below the surface. And it's this sense of coordination. So different groups are working on specific issues. So if you are, let's take the example of someone that wants to get involved. I want to make a difference. I'm not sure how. What do I do? Well, the first thing is start local. Find maybe a children's advocacy center in your area. Those are, there's hundreds of them scattered across the country, all pulled together by the great National Children's Alliance. And they provide this space where a child can go in after some form of abuse or violence. Doesn't have to be sexual, but the majority is. And they offer this really nuanced child-centered triage to try and address this. You can find a way to connect with those groups and then figure out other opportunities in the area. Maybe you can focus on a specific setting of abuse that resonates with you. If you're religious and want to work in the church, there's groups like SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. It's a group that was highlighted in the movie Spotlight, if y'all ever saw that.
Yes.
Phenomenal organization, for the most part focused on support and healing, but also interested in mobilizing towards action in the faith setting, any faith setting. Maybe you're interested in sports. Well, there's the Army of Survivors that does really good work with child athletes and making sure that they have that safe space too. So key here is you're finding something that you're passionate about that's local and resonates with you, and you get started there. And the amount of information sharing that's happening, the people that are connecting left and right, there's plenty of ways to get involved. And we're very excited at both the Brave movement and Keep Kids Safe to highlight some of those opportunities.
That's great. Is Army of Survivors, is that Grace French?
That is, yes. Phenomenal. She is a force of nature. Oh, she's fantastic.
Powerhouse.
We've even had the chance to work with her around lobbying Congress and raising awareness with different legislators and some of the committees that are popping up to address this issue. There's phenomenal people everywhere you look. You just need to know to look to them.
What can we say about the shame and stigma? So like we started the podcast because we wanted to blow the roof off the stigma and shame. And this is really kind of the first one. There was one other one we did that where little boys were targeted. And how is that different? And what have you found the difficulties in those conversations?
I love that question. That's the one that scares people off the most.
I felt scared just hearing it.
Yeah.
Right? It sounds terrifying, but it genuinely isn't. The stigma and the shame, we have learned that it's uncomfortable to talk about this. It doesn't mean it is uncomfortable to talk about. Mm-hmm. It just means that that's what we've been taught. That's what our society has communicated. When someone passes, the community gets together and they grieve. There's a funeral and there's this event that's held to mourn what has been lost. And it's very possible to have a similar model for this. Someone experiences sexual violence as a child. What's lost is their innocence. What's lost is their childhood. And being able to come together and mourn and grieve that's a beautiful thing. Not that it happened, but the fact that we can come together and say, this is not your shame to carry. We're not going to put the weight and the burden of this on a child's tiny shoulders. There's real power in building a new model. And it absolutely can happen because stigma and shame is learned behavior. It's not definitive. And if people doubt me on that, you may not see this because it's a podcast, so you can't see my face. I'm smiling most of the time I talk about it. Mm-hmm. There's no stigma and shame here. I've had the chance to shed it and realize I can say this is a terrible thing that happened to me. And I've managed to find the way to heal, to be in community with people, and to then find my way to give back and make sure it doesn't happen again. The same way that we improved automobiles to make sure that car crashes happen less and less often, and we can talk about seatbelts and road design and speed limits, we can talk about the same thing here. How do we keep kids safe? How do we protect them? That is a normal conversation. We're just afraid to have it. That's the high level. The challenge is, how do we get there? Because we know that there are a couple forces working against us. The first force is institutions that are so focused on their image, they don't want to change things. That's the challenge with the Boy Scouts, with a lot of churches. They will actually heighten that stigma and shame and say, we don't talk about this. The second is issues that happen in the home, within families themselves. The family institution is an institution. It's just really small. And if you have that culture of we don't talk about these things, then that's passing along that learned behavior. And then lastly, there's the specific nuances with different subgroups, whether you're talking along racial lines. There's a lot of people that are in the Black community that truly don't talk about homosexuality or LGBTQ issues, let alone the issues of child sexual abuse. It's one of the big things that Me Too has tackled so brilliantly, is recognizing the unique subculture. You can see something similar with boys. There's a group, phenomenal group called 1 in 6, that their goal is to break down that specific layer of stigma and shame. This is not something that defines your sexuality. This is not something that makes you less of a man. This is purely a trauma that was inflicted upon you. And if you're a child, oh, you were even more powerless at the time. There's nothing you can do, and this is not your shame to carry. Here's other men that are stepping forward, talking about it in a measured way, in an open way, in a way that's focused on healing and support. And all over the country, people are changing how they view things and feeling more open to talk about it. So it sounds like a daunting issue, and it may not be the easiest thing for us to fix, but the way to fix it, the way to address it is simple. It's simple, but not easy. And we can do it.
Once you put language in a roadmap, a lot of it's execution, and it takes a couple pioneers to exhaust that. You know, one of the things that I think just in hearing you speak might be an obstacle, I can just relate to my story. There was an aspect of, I didn't protect my family. You know, in my story, I didn't protect my wife. And I wrestled with that for a minute, and I kind of got to the conclusion that I didn't really have anything to do with that. But I'm wondering, you know, as a kid, I don't know how many the kids are going to go, I wasn't able to protect myself or handle myself. You know, that's a big male thing. Was there any of that in your household? How was your father reconciling what happened in something that was so positive otherwise?
That one's tricky. My dad had actually passed before this really bubbled to the surface. And what makes that really difficult is joining this bankruptcy involved me trying to grapple with my memory of him and all of the good that he did. He built a phenomenal scout troop. The experience that he had, you know, this one time where I was allowed to roam free around camp in a way that shouldn't have happened, that doesn't take away from all the good that he did and all the beliefs that he had around what can happen here. And it was so heavy just to show how tough stigma and shame can be if we don't address it. It took me 9 months to join the bankruptcy. I knew it was happening before it did. I could see the moves they were making. And it still took me until the last day to officially file. And about a month later on Christmas Day, my dad's birthday, actually, I attempted to take my life because it just felt like I was ripping away that memory of him. It was so attached to masculinity, to the idea of scouting, to my sense of self. And this is why it needs to change. We're so afraid of what can happen that we don't dream about what could be.
Well put.
Yeah, really well put. I'm gonna make a wild guess here that being an advocate and speaking out against all of this has been a huge part of your healing. What else have you done to heal and to go from attempting suicide to clearly thriving in the way that you are today?
I love that question because it shows that where you are is not where you can be. And that feeling of being stuck or that you're an outcast, similar to a lot of the things that y'all talk about in the world of cults or cultiness, that feeling of being the only one dealing with this, that's not a permanent state of being. One of the challenges with sexual violence, especially for children, is that feeling of I am alone in this. It happens in the shadows. It's not the September 11th big traumatic event that happens, but a whole city and nation can see it and share in that grief and that mourning. It's something that usually is pulled to the sides and never shared with people. You do feel alone in that. And when there's more people, like Nippy had said, that are blazing that path and saying, here's how I healed, and I'd like you to walk that path with me. I can reach out the hand and show you the way. Suddenly you feel less alone. And the world of advocacy has been mostly that. I'd talk to legislators. I'd help with sign-on letters or campaigns or initiatives. But the bulk of what I do is honestly just talk to people. I've talked with mothers that are trying to grapple with stuff that has happened in their own home, with family members that are abusing. I've talked with people like Grace that are taking on reputable names and saying that status symbol does not protect you. And if you do this to children, then you are going to be held accountable. I get to talk to all of these people that are stepping up or finding some way through this. And I've realized I am not even close to alone. And I get the chance to help others see that constantly. And that's such a beautiful thing. And within the Boy Scouts specifically, one of the pieces that's been mandated by the bankruptcy, this is court enforceable. If you hear language of, hey, we've set this up because it's the right thing to do, it's not true. Court demanded it. There's a youth protection committee that's getting set up to try and protect current and future generations of Scouts. And part of that committee, part of what's mandated is that half of the members have to be survivors and make sure that our voices are included in that discussion. And whether this committee is able to get set up in a way that makes a lasting impact, that shows the Scouts are truly committed to protecting the youth that they serve, that's still up in the air. We'll see if we can make that happen. But knowing that I'm taking that on alongside other people that have struggled in other ways and healed in other ways, that's beautiful. It's a reminder I'm not alone, and there's some bumpy roads ahead, but I'm not the only one navigating it. And that's a really incredible thing.
I'd say that you've earned that badge. I really see that as the irony here, is that there were certain values that the organization professed to teach, and you're embodying it in a way that I think, I think your dad would be really proud as leader.
They had asked in the film, why do you do this? And the answer I gave was, it's what an eagle would do. It's living up to the values that the organization failed to live up to. And that's the right thing. And hopefully we'll get them there. This is their one true last shot. They've gone through bankruptcy. They have this chance. There's a new youth protection executive at a higher level than Michael Johnson was, reporting directly to the CEO, essentially. And there's this youth protection committee that's still getting set up. There's a few other programs, memorials, or third-party accountability organizations that are getting added into the mix, all things that survivors negotiated in the bankruptcy. This was hard fought to even get to this. We now have the best chance that we have to take this to the next step and actually make the Scouts into an organization that's safe for children. And I hope we can land it. I hope we can get there. But if we can't, the organization has forfeited its right to serve children and be the group that holds up the flag of Scouting. They don't. It's up to them whether or not they want to do the right thing. Right. And I'm just going to be out there constantly telling them what that right thing is.
That's great. Where are you in that process, do you think, and how realistic, and what's the timeline? What's the inertia like?
I think that's three questions that are, I don't know, I'm not sure, and we'll see.
Okay. That's fair. No, those are answers.
It's early stage, but we're having the conversations. And there's a few pieces that we're able to leverage. There is this court enforceable document that has very explicit pieces laid out, and we're going to hold to those as best we can. And then there's just leveraging the other resources that we have. I have no doubt in my mind that the new youth protection executive, a man named Glenn Pounder, is well suited for the job. He's great. Brilliant. He's got a great background. He knows the challenges of the 21st century and how technology is actually a challenge within Scouting. He's got a great idea. The question is whether we can get leadership and the culture to change where it needs to. And that won't get answered for a few months, let alone a few years.
Tom, is there anything that you think we missed in terms of your particular passionate talking points that you want our audience to know?
I have one final piece. So
Yes.
I appreciate that. I'm a big fan of quotes that carry through time. It shows that at the end of the day, we're all still human, and what resonates decades or generations ago can still resonate now. And there's this quote that I'd found from Robert F. Kennedy that he'd given in Cape Town, South Africa. And he said, the answer is to rely on youth. If we're trying to solve our problems, the answer is to rely on youth. It's not a time of life, but a state of mind. A temper of the will, a quality of imagination, a predominance of courage over timidity, and a desire or an appetite for adventure over the love of ease. And if we're going to solve this problem of sexual violence against children and adolescents that shows up in organizations and culty behaviors or in the home or in any part of our society, if we're going to address that, we need the mindset of youth to think about what can happen, to imagine a world that can actually be there. There's courage. Kids get out there. They just build a fort. They just do crazy things and imagine what can be. And we get the chance to do that. And if you're in the US and you're interested in taking action and joining us, Keep Kids Safe is just getting started. We will be holding monthly State of the Movement meetings so you can see everything that's going on and get connected. We'll be highlighting other organizations that are taking action in communities across the country. And we'll be otherwise pushing opportunities for you to get involved in a way that works for you at whatever scale or ability you have. Anytime, any level, you can make a difference. And if you're interested in that, you can go to keepkidsafe.us. That's keepkidsafe.us. If you're global, come on by to the Brave movement. Very similar mindset. We're watching action happen all around the world. We're watching people work on statute of limitations reform, influence how the largest tech companies are building platforms that protect children first and recognize the importance of that. We're seeing all kinds of efforts to do prevention education and change culture. And we're encouraging people constantly to be brave, because this can be something that's fearful or nervous, anxiety producing. But that's the point of bravery. It's doing it in spite of that and reminding yourself that being brave does not mean being alone. So you can go to bravemovement.org to engage at the global level.
So, and where can people reach out to you directly or personally?
The best way is to come on by my newsletter that I'm starting. It's a weekly newsletter called The Solstice that talks about those moments where darkness turns to light and the greatest change can happen in the darkest of times. And you can find that at tomkrumins.us and follow me on Substack.
Excellent. Well, Tom, it's been a pleasure. I love this part of our job. It doesn't feel like a job. It's just connecting with somebody who I find really inspiring. I hope you keep us posted on what's happening so we can update our audience, because I'm sure they'll want to know.
Oh, absolutely. The goal is to make sure we're having these conversations and we're pushing the information out there and letting people know.
Tom, thank you so much for coming a little bit culty, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Tom.
Good to be here.
Like what you hear, do you? Give us a rating, a review, and subscribe on iTunes. Every little bit helps us get this cult awareness content out there. Smash that subscribe button. You know you want to.
Well, dear listeners, we hope that you enjoyed that as much as we did. I think Tom is now one of my new personal heroes. How about you, Nip?
Yeah, I think his way of handling the shame and saying, look at me right now. If you could see me right now, I'm telling the story with a smile on my face. So he is an example for people who are struggling with that, and probably has a pretty good process and more knowledge to share with anyone who's dealing with that.
Also, highly recommend watching the documentary. And I probably should have said this at the beginning. I'm sure there's going to be a million people writing in saying what a great experience they may have had in the Boy Scouts. And I will say, like I've said with every group in the past, I'm glad you had a good experience.
Well, he says that too. So
yeah, just a reminder that we're not talking about the good in this podcast. Well, we are a little bit, but also what was the bad. And the documentary does go into more detail. And I was specifically also quite rattled with how the Mormons were somehow sacrosanct in this whole debacle, and just the regressive predator-friendly laws. There's a lot of things that are just wildly shocking in this doc. and specifically how they target single mothers, these organizations. And offering to take a young boy off a single mother's hand to go camping is like, I could see that just being such a gift, and not understanding the red flags there. It's just so devastating to look back on in retrospect. But watch the doc, let us know what you think. And if you feel compelled to check out the organizations in your neighborhood, figuring out if they're continuing operations, and if so, how, and are they changing their policies to protect from such things. See you next time. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean, I'm hanging on to the weight of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We're heading over to patreon.com/alittlebitculty now to discuss this episode. In the meantime, dear listener, please remember, this podcast is solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. It's not intended as a substitute for real medical, legal, or therapeutic advice. For cult recovery resources and to learn more about seeking safely in this culty world, check out alittlebitculty.com/culty resources, and don't miss Sarah's TED Talk called How Cult Literate Are You? Great stuff.
A Little Bit Culty is a Trace 120 production, executive produced by Sarah Edmondson and Anthony Nippy Ames, in collaboration with producer Will Rutherford at Citizens of Sound and our co-creator and show chaplain/bodyguard, Jess Temple Tardy. Our show writer is Holly Zadra, and our theme song, Cultivated, is by John Bryant.